across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time in this first hour today talking about the decline of a nation, why empires fall, and in some respects, maybe learn a little bit about the history of what has happened in the past so that we can prevent that from happening in the future. This day that we're talking about is significant because on February 17th, 1776, that's 250 years ago, is when Edward Gibbon published his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This ended up being 6 volumes, which are oftentimes referred to as some of the greatest historical work ever written. It covers the time period really from the reign of Trajan all the way to the fall of Constantinople. And as the title, I think, implies, Edward Gibbon not only wanted to document, but even try to uncover what brought down one of the greatest powers the world has ever seen. Now, I think we have to point out the fact that I'm not an Edward Gibbon, and second of all, I would disagree with him because he was a strong critic of Christianity. As a matter of fact, he actually attributed part of the decline of the Roman Empire to the rise of Christianity. So obviously, we will look at things from a different point of view, and also we're going to look at a lot of empires, not just Rome, but to maybe illustrate why it was so important is that if you look at the 2 continental congresses that took place in Philadelphia, as we are talking about the 250th anniversary of this country, since, of course, the Declaration of Independence, so many times the framers of the Constitution, first the founders, then the framers, were actually talking about Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy. In some respects, they were very significantly influenced by the publication of this series of volumes. And as independence became more of a possibility, the individuals that were really at the helm of the founding of this country and later the framing of our Constitution really wanted to consider what sort of government should replace the King of England and the Parliament. And so in some respects, they understood some of the warnings of Edward Gibbon, but they also recognized that maybe it was time to try a republic that was based on Christian principles, not on those secular principles of Rome or not even on the Enlightenment principles that some people were holding to. And that brings us to a very famous quote from John Adams, who was there at these Continental Congresses, was the first vice president, later became the second president, whose son also became a president. But he made a comment about the fact that this idea of a Christian republic would make sense, but it was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. As we go through this hour, I do point you to some of the articles that we have posted. Some of these are things that I have written on the question of why empires fall, even on the whole question of historical cycles, which of course is one of the booklets we have made available to you, and even one in the past on the decline of a nation. So if you find yourself saying, this was very interesting, I'd like to pass it on to my children and my grandchildren, I'd like to pull some quotes out of it and maybe post it somewhere, you are free to do so, and you will find that at the website, pointofview.net. But we're going to be looking at history, and I recognize that some of you may really love history. Some of you might just have endured history, but why are we doing that? Well, I come to a couple of famous quotes. George Santayana said, "Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it." Even the philosopher George Hegel said, "What experience and history teach us is this, that people and government never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it, By the way, that's very skeptical, and it's not true. And even Winston Churchill made the joke one time, the one thing we've learned from history is we don't learn from history. I think we can learn some lessons. I think the founders understood the importance of studying history, and I understand today that there are leaders, even in our own government, and leaders in other governments around the world that are recognizing that we are in possibly a dangerous time. And that can be best illustrated by one of the first things I point out in my article, and that is there is a YouTube video that has been making the rounds, so you can find a link to it to see it for yourself. But it describes a pattern that has actually destroyed 3 global superpowers. We're going to get to Rome in just a minute, but let's bring it up to date. And they point out that in 1590, Spain was the richest empire on earth. Spain controlled half of the world's gold and silver. Spain's military really dominated Europe. Their currency was accepted everywhere. Yet, within 80 years, the Spanish government was bankrupt. They go on to talk about how the Spanish coin that was supposed to be pure silver became kind of half copper, then 75% copper. By 1600, the Spanish coin actually had no silver, and as a result, inflation exploded. They went into a debt spiral, and all sorts of problems unfolded. They go on to talk about in 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. At the time, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Britain controlled 25% of the land surface. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Yet within 40 years, the empire was gone. The currency collapsed. Britain had too many military commitments around the world. They did win World War I, but at a terrible cost. And by 1931, Britain had to abandon the gold standard, and the pound lost 25% of its value overnight. In 1991, the Soviet Union still seemed dominant. It was another superpower. It had nuclear weapons, global influence, satellites spanning the globe, yet the Soviet Union ceased to exist 900 days later due to economic implosion. Well, we're going to be talking about the decline of many of these empires, and this video, which, again, you might want to look at in its entirety, we have a link to it on the website, points out that there are really kind of 7 stages of collapse that these writers have identified. In just a few minutes, those of you that would be watching, we would be holding up some of the books, but that is, I think, a resource that you might want to take advantage of as well. But the authors of this YouTube video point out that if you look at those 7 stages, America has actually completed 5 of those stages. And so the argument is simply this: if we want to end up like the rest of these empires, then just keep going down the road and don't make any mid-course corrections. If indeed we believe that there could be still a great golden age for America in the 21st century, we have to first admit some of the problems and bring about some of the corrections. So when we come back, we're going to start off with a very good book by Victor Davis Hanson, The End of Everything. Then we're going to go to a piece that I think you will appreciate as well by Johan Norberg on Peak Human. A lot of very smart people have been writing about this, and we'll have a chance to hear from them through their works right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Columnist Robert Knight usually writes commentaries on political issues, but took 2 columns to address the growing concerns about cell phone use. He began by reminding us of some of the benefits. Remember what it was like to try to connect with someone arriving at an airport or losing written directions on the way to a destination? Once he dispensed with a brief acknowledgement of its benefits, he then proceeded to remind us of the many concerns surfacing about cell phones. He observes that the social effects of ubiquitous cell phones are obvious. Kids are always looking at their phones, whether they're waiting for the bus or sitting at a table with others. In previous commentaries, I've quoted social psychologist Jonathan Haidt about his research on the impact of social media on young people. Recently, he posed this question to ChatGPT. If you were the devil, how would you destroy the next generation without them even knowing it? The answer he received was, I'd keep them busy, always distracted. I'd watch their minds rot slowly, sweetly, silently, and the best part is they'd never know it was me. They'd call it freedom. Robert Knight reminds us that Jonathan Haidt has developed what he called the 4 norms that can help deal with the negative concerns about cell phones. He recommends no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, phone-free schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, and more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. Responsible parents should limit screen time for their children, but that assumes that they can limit their own time. They should be working to develop character and self-discipline in themselves and their children. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Topic today, talking about the collapse of empires, and I'm going to give you a negative and a positive from 2 individuals. Of course, many of the people that I'm quoting here have actually been interviewed on Point of View, and you might want to take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net, and find some of those. But the first one comes from our friend Victor Davis Hanson. He's been on the program many times with us, but his book, The End of Everything, How Wars Descend into Annihilation, reminds us that there have been times in history where various empires and civilizations have been virtually wiped off the map. And he picks 4 particular historical examples: the city-state of Thebes, ancient Carthage, Byzantine Constantinople, and the Aztec Empire. I'll go through each one of those, and then we'll talk about, from Johann Norberg, Peak Human, what we can learn from the rise and fall of golden ages, because many of the countries and empires we'll be talking about really had this great golden age. But first of all, if you talk about Thebes, Victor Davis Hanson explains that the leveling of Thebes by Alexander the Great, the erasure of Carthage by Scipio, the conquest and transformation of Constantinople by the Sultan and the Muslims, and the obliteration of the Aztecs, I think all marked an end of cultures and civilizations. Alexander, for example, brought an end to classical Greece. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Mediterranean world as kind of the nexus of European commerce. And the largest cathedral in the West became the greatest mosque in the Islamic world. And so he makes a very strong argument that this should be a warning to us. And again, knowing that you might not want to read through this book, it is fascinating, very depressing sometimes. I also provide you a link to a 5-minute video summary that he produced for our friends at Hillsdale College. But he says the book is about the existential destruction of the losing side in a war. And he says this is very rare in history. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it should enlighten us in how it does, why it does, and can it happen again. He also explains that he wrote the book not just kind of as a historical journey to document the rare cases of a targeted nation being completely destroyed, but as a warning that human nature doesn't change. I think there's been this assumption oftentimes foisted on us first from Karl Marx, but then through humanistic psychology and a variety of other things that, well, we're above that. And yet I think we've seen only so well that human sin nature still is with us and will continue to be that way. He says we sometimes naively assumed that globalization would create a common humanity and bring an end to global conflict. And in my interview at the time with Senator Marco Rubio, now of course Secretary of State, he said, well, some of the nations didn't get the memo about that. And instead, we recognize we probably have more existential threats than ever before. He also reminds that the same mentalities and delusions that doom the Thebans, the Carthaginians, the Byzantines, and the Aztecs are still with us today. Even as they were about to be slaughtered, some of them may still been thinking, it cannot happen here. And he wants us to be aware of the fact that indeed this could happen to us as well. And that's why we need to understand the importance of the military, understand of a stable economy, understand what actually provides human flourishing. Those are important issues. And he reminds us that the world needs a strong America so that we can prevent the end of everything. Well, that's pretty dark. Let's talk about something more positive. And the historian Johann Norberg, who I've quoted before, has written this book called Peak Human, What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages. And he takes us through a number of great civilizations, ancient Athens, of course, the Roman Republic, Renaissance Italy, Dutch Republic, and even today's what he calls the Anglosphere. And he said each one of these had their golden age and contributed to the world today. Ancient Greece gave us democracy, this idea of the rule of law. From the Muslim world, let's give credit, came algebra, modern medicine. The Dutch Republic gave us economic ideas and some of the greatest artistic movements. He explained that he picked these civilizations because each of them exemplifies what can be described as a golden age. There was a period of innovations, and that revolutionized many fields and sectors in a short period of time. The characteristics are cultural creativity, scientific discussions, technological achievements, and economic growth. And he laments that human history is a long list of deprivations and horrors, but it's also the source of knowledge and institutions and technologies that set most of humanity free from some of those horrors. It requires, as he said, raw material, but the citizens needed to be free to experiment and innovate without being subject to feudal lords or centralized governments or even ravaging armies. Again, you may not read the book. I've got it in my possession, but you can, again, find a link that I give to you to an interview he did with John Stossel, where he talked about how Rome inspired our form of government. We have a republic with checks and balances. Where did that come from? Well, some of that was in seed form even back there in some of the other empires. And he went on to say there's a reason that we have a Senate and they meet in a capital. Those are ideas borrowed from the Romans. Of course, these empires fell. And he points out that one of the reasons they fell, ask yourself if this sounds familiar, the emperors wanted to become popular by handing out free stuff to people, he said. Originally, this started small. You just handed the very poor means of subsistence, but it was popular. So the group that lived on the public's expense grew larger all the time. Eventually, what you had was an ever-expanding system of entitlements that became too much. Johann Norberg put it this way: Romans could conquer the world, but they couldn't do entitlement reform. To pay for this, the Roman emperors devalued their currency by putting less gold and silver in each coin. And he concluded that inflation was much worse than barbarian invaders. And if you think about this, it really does sound like our world today, doesn't it? It is, I think, a great illustration in the fact that we live in this world in which we have those in power. They may not be emperors. They may just be politicians. They may not even necessarily be elected individuals. They may just be there as part of the bureaucracy. But in order to sort of win over the people, are willing to give out lots of free stuff. But somebody has to pay for it. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And today we are in this world in which modern governments, including our own, make more financial promises than they can keep. To pay for it, they print more money. And we've been living in this golden age, but the question we have to ask ourselves is, will it continue? But I might also add a disclaimer that is not in any of these books, but something I've said, and I've heard a few others say it as well. When you look at the history of many of these empires, usually one empire falls and another rises to take its place. And the first part of my article that we have posted for you sort of implies that. we are in a very different and maybe unique situation historically, because even if the United States were to fall, who's going to replace it? Now, some of you that are as old as I am might remember a time during the 1970s and 80s we were said, well, the dynamo is going to be Japan, and the whole Pacific Rim is just going to be eventually completely out-competing the United States. And we saw all sorts of Japanese cars coming over and everything else. Does anybody seriously think Japan is going to take over a vacuum that the United States would leave? I don't. It has got its own problems, some of which are demographic. You have more older people than younger people. It's an island that is dependent on oil, and it cannot produce, in many cases, enough of its own energy. That makes them dependent on others. So more recently, we've heard China. Well, China has some of the same problems because of the one-child policy, because of some of their financial issues, because of their own debt as well. And so we're living in a very unusual time indeed, where we're really not exactly sure what might replace the United States if the United States did not set the course. And of course, you've seen some of our leaders here have said, we are going to set our own course, and we'd like Europe and other countries to follow us, but if they don't, we're going to try to make sure that we survive through the 21st century. But it's a different kind of set of circumstances than we've seen in our past history. So we're going to take a break. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about maybe the United States in particular, maybe some of these historical cycles. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read some of that, it's on the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, spending some time talking about the collapse of empires. And some of you might be saying, well, this is a great history lesson, but, I got to deal with day to day. And I understand that. But I thought it would also be important to recognize that we do need to be thinking about the future. It has been a phrase that I've used more than once. For every person worried about the end of the world, there are 1 million people worried about the end of the month. And I understand that. You live in a world in which you're trying to just make ends meet. But you know what? The Bible is very clear that sometimes we find ourselves in a position where we can make a difference. For example, Esther realized that she lived in a time such as this, perhaps to make a difference. We can think of the sons of Issachar, 1 Chronicles 12:32, that were men who understood the times, with knowledge of what Israel was to do. We need to understand what our country needs to do. We need to understand, even apart from that, what the Church of Jesus Christ needs to do in this 21st century. But I thought for a minute I would at least bring some of that back to America. And a while back we did an interview with our good friend Cal Thomas, in which it was entitled America's Expiration Date, the Fall of Empires and Superpowers and the Future of the United States. That's a book he wrote a while back, but they updated it. And again, we have a link to not only the book, but to the radio program if you would like to listen to it again. But he starts with an observation, which I'm going to come back to in just a minute in a fuller detail. And this comes from Sir John Glubb. Sir John Glubb wrote in The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival, a book that probably don't want to read, but you would love to know about, a very interesting fact. And that is, Sir John Glubb concluded that the average age of a nation or an empire's greatness is about 250 years. This is America in 250 years, so think that through. Now, most nations lose their way in a relatively short period of time. You have some that lasted much longer, like the Roman Empire. You had some that lasted much shorter, the Carthaginians and others. You can come up with all sorts of variations, but it is interesting that if you use that ruler, then Cal Thomas takes you through his book about kind of a history lesson, and he looks at the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Arab Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and then the United States. Well, we've covered some of those, so I won't go into some of the detail that's in the written material, but first of all, let's recognize that each empire fell for different reasons. If there is a commonality, it is that they debased their currency, but there were a lot of other things as well. Sometimes they fell because they became too prosperous and too apathetic. We've seen that before. You've probably heard quotes that people will be citing during the 4th of July about that. Some fell because they had an empire that was too overextended. Most had a period of decadence and decline. As a matter of fact, the Spanish Empire, which we mentioned just a few minutes ago, was so riven with conflict that they were never even invaded or taken over because other countries didn't see anything worth conquering. If you look at some of the others, Persia's decline was due in large part to class struggle. The common people, who are not part of the upper class, began organizing riots and revolts. The kings, well, they were just too greedy, started stealing from the nation's wealth rather than sharing some of that wealth with the people. And so as a result, the social structure collapsed. And, of course, we've been talking about Rome, so let's come to it one more time. First of all, the fall of Rome was really gradual. Remember the familiar phrase, Rome wasn't built in a day? Well, neither was it destroyed in a day. As it grew, though, more money needed to be provided for the military. The empire's infrastructure suffered. The common people suffered because the ruling class cared more about what was on the next horizon than what was at home. And so, in some respects, Cal Thomas ends his book, and this is, again, a Cliff's Notes summary of some of these books, with the hope that we could and still have time to resurrect the Republic. But the answer, he argues, isn't going to be found in our politicians. It's our future really doesn't depend on the White House as much as certainly government can provide the structure for the future, but it's going to be really more dependent on what we do in our own house than what we do in the White House. And he talks about the need for us to set standards of decency, reevaluate the education of our children and grandchildren, go and make disciples, and all sorts of other things that he talks about. But I thought, if nothing else, he gives us a warning that unless we do some very significant mid-course correction, we're in for the same kind of future that we saw with those empires. And so as we wind down for today, and I'll get into some of this in a little more detail in the next segment, let's talk about cycles in history, because we're sort of implying that there are. And so my other article for you is Historical Cycles. Those of you, for example, that actually are Truth Team members may have received my booklet a while back on the subject. But the article I've posted here year is a longer version. Again, I recognize that we try to have about 1,600, 1,700 words in a booklet, a very short summary. This one goes on in a lot more detail. So even if you have the booklet, you might want to get this article. But again, we recognize that history seems to be in cycles. Now, we don't mean it in the terms of way Eastern religion talks about cycles. You maybe have heard the phrase, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Or this one coming out of this idea of the fourth turning, which we've talked about before. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. And so we have seen sometimes cycles that have unfolded before our very eyes. Briefly, over the next few minutes, I want to try to mention that there are different kinds of cycles. One that we've sort of been talking about has been kind of a political, cultural cycle. Another would be a generational cycle, which I sort of alluded to there. There's also, of course, a technological cycle, and certainly we have seen a financial cycle as well. And so much of this has come to us. But before we take a break, I thought it might be good to quote from another interview that I did, and this is from Andrew Wilson. Andrew Wilson was on our program with his book called Remaking the World. And looking at it more from a British point of view, which was helpful because he talks about 1776 as being a year that witnessed 7 transformations taking place. Globalization, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Great Enrichment, the American Revolution, the rise of post-Christianity, and the dawn of Romanticism. Won't get into all of those, but if you think about that, when we as Americans think of 1776, well, that's the year of the Declaration of Independence. Well, he's British, and he's looking at a lot broader issue than just that, although that's one of the chapters in the book. 1776 was also the year when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. Just mentioned a minute ago, Edward Gibbon publishing, of course, a very significant document, which was, of course, the rise and fall and decline of the Roman Empire. But nevertheless, the decline and fall of Roman Empire was in 1776, but so was The Wealth of Nations. But it also was the year in which James Watt invented the steam engine, and that really spawned what we now call the Industrial Revolution. So both capitalism and the Industrial Revolution had a very significant impact in a number of ways. First of all, it led to a significant increase in life expectancy. If you've ever seen some of the charts, and we've posted those before, about life expectancy, well, that picked up rather dramatically by the time you get into the 19th century. And so that was certainly the case. But along with it was also the rise of social development and the rise of some kind of economic flourishing that actually took place. And so in some respects, we are talking about this remarkable year of 1776, not only because we can talk about, for example, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire or the Declaration of Independence or Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation or many other things, but it was a real significant turning point. So when we come back from the break, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about a couple of these political and cultural cycles because, and spoiler alert, I'll give you my conclusion on the front end, all of these cycles now converge right now. Fascinating. It's only been a few times in all of history where all of these cycles come together all at once. So this, again, provides an opportunity to actually create that golden age that Johann Norberg talked about, or end up, again, just seeing the collapse of another empire. So we'll come back and certainly do encourage you to get some of the articles we posted today on the website on why empires fall. We'll come back, we'll talk a little bit about historical cycles right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
For the minutes we have left, let's see if we can look at some of these historical cycles. And the first one I mentioned was a political cultural cycle, which tends to happen about every 80 years. Matter of fact, it turns out to be almost 84 years. And for example, you can go back to 1848 and you have Karl Marx publishing the Communist Manifesto and other works related to that as well. And the political and social impact of his Marxist perspective really swept through Europe. It changed the political structure of many countries and really still is an influence today. Well, you add 84 years to that, and you come to the 1930s. What's going on then? Well, in Europe, you have the rise of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. In this country, you have the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who signed into law a significant number of New Deal programs that vastly expanded the scope of government, still influential to our world today. And many of the so-called alphabet soup of programs and federal agencies go all the way back to what happened in the 1930s. We'll add another 84 years and you come to 2016. What's going on then? Well, in Europe, you have the political battles known as Brexit, the decision of the UK to leave the European Union. You had all sorts of populist uprisings. What happened in our country in 2016? Well, that was the election of a populist by the name of Donald Trump. You also had the turmoil in Europe. You had the farmer protests in the Netherlands, the so-called Yellow Jacket protests. We had, of course, in our country, the BLM protest and Antifa protest, and then you come to where we find ourselves today. But if you want to look at the broader issue, we mentioned just a few minutes ago Sir John Glubb, who noticed that most empires last about 250 years. And so, of course, the key date there is 1776, that not only marked the beginning of the nation, Declaration of Independence, but also the promotion of capitalism, Adam Smith, and the publication of The Wealth of Nations. But if you go back 250 years, what was going on then? It's called the Protestant Reformation. Began when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door. But here we are 25 years after 1776. And again, we have maybe a strategic opportunity when we talk about some of these political and cultural cycles. There's also this idea of a generational cycle. No doubt you've heard some people talking about a fourth turning. What are they talking about? Well, about a quarter century ago, William Strauss and Neil Howell wrote a best-selling book, The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy. And in it, they argued that history could be understood in turnings or cycles of four. Each cycle spans a length longer than a human being, roughly 80 to 100 years. And so you have a first turning, which is high. You have a second turning, which is an awakening. You have a third turning, which is an unraveling. And then you have a fourth turning, which is a crisis. Again, you can read all the details in my article, but they were predicting that there would be perhaps some very significant political, economic, and social upheavals that would happen in the 2020s. Well, that's where we are right now. 2008 economic crisis, and then the changes we just talked about in 2016. And of course, last year, Neil Howe wrote another book, which I have in my possession, The Fourth Turning is Here, and arguing that there is a crisis in government. There's a loss of public trust in any institution, and a need for us to begin to think about what that might bring in the future. They remind us that when we've had other fourth turnings, we had one, the American Revolution, had another fourth turning, that was the Civil War, and another fourth turning, that was World War II. Are you seeing a trend here? And that's, of course, a generational cycle. Well, two more real quickly. We also have a technological cycle, and that is interesting. That seems to be about 50 years. And so you go from, say, the 18th century in which we were an agricultural society to one I mentioned just a few minutes ago to an industrial society. Add 50 years later, that's the age of steam and railways that changed the world significantly. Up until that time, you had manpower, horsepower. That's it. Trains could run on steam. Steamships changed the world in significant ways. Now people could move faster. They could carry heavier loads. 50 years after that, you have steel and electricity. I don't think anybody realizes how important steel was in terms of buildings, because brick buildings could only be a few stories high, but steel allowed designers to create skyscrapers, to build bridges over larger sections of water, and, of course, electricity. I think, again, anytime the lights go out, remind ourselves how important electricity is to us as well. 50 years after that, well, you had oil and automobiles, and even just a whole revolution in mass production. Automobiles now provided people with the ability to go wherever they wanted without having to walk or ride a horse or catch a train. Advances in mass production enhanced the Industrial Revolution that already took place. By the 1970s, we were in an age of information and telecommunications. This came with the development first of the transistor and then the microchip, and then we have, of course, the digital world, which today we find ourselves in a world of what? Fast computers, artificial intelligence, even genetic engineering. Now, of course, we have creative graphics, but we also begin to wonder what is true and what is not. We can genetically engineer animals and even human beings. We live in a very different world than we've ever seen before. But before we end, let's also talk about a financial cycle, which we've already sort of illustrated. And that is, if you look at the cycle of nations, you can see that for a while there was a financial superpower, maybe Portugal with the Portuguese real. Then we talked about Spain and the Spanish real. Then we talked about the Netherlands, the Dutch guilder. Then France, the French franc. The British, the pound sterling, and of course today we have the U.S. dollar. But there has been a question as to what is the future of money and whether or not we will be able to pay our bills. And so this debt crisis, which we are dealing with in this country, is even more significant in other countries as well. And so there are only a few options when you have this debt crisis. You could default on the debt, but that's probably not going to happen, although some nations have done that. You could try to tax the citizens, but there's just not enough money to tax everybody to cover the size of those national debts. And so ultimately they end up, what? Printing more money. Now, for a while that may work, but all you have to do is look at Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe or Venezuela to recognize that doesn't work very well at all. So as we've kind of winding down today, it's just a reminder that perhaps we can learn from history. Perhaps we can recognize that there was a rise and a fall of empires, but some of those empires had a golden age. Sometimes they reversed course and continued on a little bit longer because they were students of history and understood how important it is for us to learn from history rather than to ignore it. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to cover that. But from a biblical point of view, I think it reminds us once again, 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32. The sons of Issachar were men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. And so we may not know what the future is, but we know who holds the future. But at the same time, I hope this would encourage you to pray for those in authority, because some very important decisions and changes need to be made if we don't want to just become another country in the dustbin of history. So, again, I hope you will go to our website, pointofview.net. You'll find some articles that I've written on why empires fall, another one on historical cycles. They're resources for you. And, of course, if you join with us at the Truth Team level, we make many of these booklets available to you as a way of saying thank you for your support. And you've been listening to Point of View.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Mark sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we can get into some of the issues in the news, and wasn't planning on talking about this, but again, we now know a lot more about that shooting up there in the hockey rink, and it is even more troubling than whenever we hear of a shooting. In this particular case, if you're not familiar, this is one that took place in Providence, Rhode Island, although I think they're actually talking to people at Pawtucket, Rhode Island, but we're talking about a shooting that took place about 15 minutes away from Brown University, and you might have remembered that shooting that took place there. So we have two horrific shootings that have taken place in really, I guess, to be the smallest state in the Union in Rhode Island. And, of course, the reasons are slightly different, but in some respects, this ties together to some other stories. And that is, again, the shooter left a video confession making clear he planned this attack for months and insisted that his victims deserve their death. These are very troubled individuals. And the families that were attending this high school hockey game in Providence, Rhode Island on Monday witnessed this horror of this gunman, and I'm going to use gunman, although notice in a minute we'll see all of the various news outlets refer to this man now thinking he's a woman or her, whatever, how you want to play those pronouns, as a shooter. But anyway, the gunman fired 14 shots, killing 2 people, leaving another 3 in critical condition before turning the gun on himself. Of course, now we also know there were others that were killed that were part of the family. But how was this prevented from being even a worse mass shooting? It gets us back to, again, a good Samaritan who intervened and attempted to subdue the subject, which, again, left at least a little bit of an end to this horrific situation. And a lot of people will notice, as Jim Garrity points out in his piece today, that the gunman legally had a masculine name, but went by a feminine name. And, of course, we'll wonder if he was a transsexual. Well, now that wonder probably is pretty much confirmed. And whether or not he was on some kind of medication, because I want to bring that back as well. There is, of course, the issue of transgenderism. We've talked about this a lot lately here on Point of View once again. But the other part of that gets back to not only our booklet on transgenderism, but our drug use booklet, because that is of real concern. And I'll get to that in just a minute. Again, back to the point that Jim Garrity makes, though, is the Associated Press article was sure that they did not want to use intergender pronouns, so use the term shooter. And that is, I think, again, the issue that is illustrating the fact that we just can't even speak honestly about some of these horrific things taking place. And to put that in perspective, as I mentioned last week, there was a Babylon Bee that was just sort of trying to poke fun in a kind of a tragic sort of way on the inability, in this case they picked on CNN, to see 3 different trans shooters. This would now be the 4th. And the only thing we could see they had in common is they were all white. But this is a transgender shooter who is, last week, we have another transgender shooter, so we have one a week now. The transgender shooter there in the British Columbia part of Canada was an individual that killed 6 people and then killed herself. Again, in August 2025, we had a man identified as a woman who killed 2 children and shot 30 others in the mass at a Catholic school. And then, of course, the one that we've talked about in Nashville of a man identifying as a woman killed 3 9-year-old children and 3 adults before being shot and killed by police. For those of you keeping score at home, we're up to at least 4 very prominent transgender shooters. And that is something that the press does not want to talk about. As a matter of fact, if you bring it up, that's supposed to be transphobic. But there is something to think about, and that is this. Mass shootings are very rare. Even though we do hear about them with some regularity in the press, transgender individuals are also rare. And when you combined those 2 very rare traits, you are talking about something that would illustrate that these, and I'll just use the 4, but there are probably others that we haven't heard as much about that illustrate that maybe something is wrong. Let's again recognize that it could be the medication, or it could be the attitude, or it could be, I think more realistically, both. Because I think it's natural to wonder whether some people are on the kind of medications that you would have to take to alter your hormones, whether or not that could cause extreme reactions or even psychotic reactions. Is that reasonable? Again, these are the conversations you cannot have in the legacy press. The mainstream media won't let you talk about those, but let's have an honest conversation about that. Or you could think about it the other way. Maybe people with pre-existing psychological issues, gender dysphoria, might be prone to lash out, and the drugs make it even more possible because it removes some of the barriers. But nevertheless, the most recent stories coming out are the fact that this particular suspect in this ice rink shooting is, according to court documents now, actually a transgender individual who has been feuding with his family for years over his decision to identify as a woman. And so we now know a little bit more about that. This individual killed himself after shooting his son's mother, injuring, of course, 3 others at the hockey game as well. The Pawtucket police chief there said the shooting arose out of a family dispute. At a press conference he mentioned on Monday, we have now court documents which talk about this individual who used different names for himself, now herself, and he even went to the police to report that his father-in-law insisted that he leave the family home because of his recent gender transition surgery. And if you look at the divorce documents, and we'll leave it at this, it shows that the reason for the divorce was gender reassignment surgery and narcissistic personality disorder traits. But then those reasons were then crossed out on the divorce certificate and replaced with irreconcilable differences, which have caused the immediate breakdown of the marriage. Like I said, if you're keeping score, you recognize that this is at least 4 that we know about that all ended in very tragic mass shootings. And I think it's an illustration of something that we need to be able to discuss, and yet probably is going to be ignored very often in the mainstream press. But we're willing to venture into these discussions, and a little bit later we'll open up the phones in case you have some comments. But that's an issue in the news, and I thought we'd give you some perspective on it. We'll come back and talk about what's going on in Minnesota right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Columnist Robert Knight usually writes commentaries on political issues, but took 2 columns to address the growing concerns about cell phone use. He began by reminding us of some of the benefits. Remember what it was like to try to connect with someone arriving at an airport or losing written directions on the way to a destination? Once he dispensed with a brief acknowledgement of its benefits, he then proceeded to remind us of the many concerns surfacing about cell phones. He observes that the social effects of ubiquitous cell phones are obvious. Kids are always looking at their phones, whether they're waiting for the bus or sitting at a table with others. In previous commentaries, I've quoted social psychologist Jonathan Haidt about his research on the impact of social media on young people. Recently, he posed this question to ChatGPT. If you were the devil, how would you destroy the next generation without them even knowing it? The answer he received was, I'd keep them busy, always distracted. I'd watch their minds rot slowly, sweetly, silently, and the best part is they'd never know it was me. They'd call it freedom. Robert Knight reminds us that Jonathan Haidt has developed what he called the 4 norms that can help deal with the negative concerns about cell phones. He recommends no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, phone-free schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, and more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. Responsible parents should limit screen time for their children, but that assumes that they can limit their own time. They should be working to develop character and self-discipline in themselves and their children. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the articles that we have posted here is by our good friend Kevin McCullough. He's going to be with us next week, I believe. But he's a talk show host, and we seem to be quoting him quite often. But this one is entitled Own It, and it brings us back to Minnesota. I think he's really set it up well by helping us understand the kind of mindset that is found in some of our political leaders, and the reason why we need to reevaluate who we're going to vote for, even during these midterm elections. He says because we have, of course, the federal government is now kind of wrapped up its Operation Minnesota. So he said you would have expected maybe a little bit of humility from the state and city leaders who spent months trying to resist what was being implemented at the time. You might have expected a sober acknowledgement that things went sideways. You might have even expected, at a minimum, a recognition that cooperation could have spared everyone a lot of pain. And if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Because he said instead, Governor Tim Walz and Minnesota Mayor Jacob Frey chose entitlement. Are you ready for this? They demanded reimbursement from the federal government. He says, let that sink in. After obstructing federal law enforcement, after refusing basic cooperation, after fueling tension with reckless rhetoric, and after helping turn a law enforcement effort into a prolonged public spectacle, they now want taxpayers to foot the bill. I'm laughing, but it's pretty pathetic. He says the audacity is breathtaking. There's some other words for it. Some we can use on air, some we can't. Chutzpah, gall, but I won't use some of the others, but you know what we're getting at here. And he says what makes this demand laughable isn't just the hypocrisy. It's a complete lack of self-awareness. These leaders behaved as if they had no role at all in what unfolded, as if this chaos just developed in the sky and came crashing down to earth. That was just amazing. Anyway, from the beginning, he says Minnesota's leadership chose resistance over responsibility. Then when enforcement became complicated, drawn out, and volatile, they act surprised. He says they shouldn't have been. Violence erupted. Lives were lost, communities were traumatized, businesses suffered, law-abiding residents lived with fear and disruption for months. None of this was inevitable. Much of it was preventable. And again, for skeptics, he doesn't say this, but for skeptics that say, well, it only happened in Minnesota, does that not tell you something? Because it did not happen in other places where the deportation actions were taking place. And so it illustrates again what was actually festering there as well. He goes on to say, instead, Minnesota's leaders chose defiance. They treated federal authority as optional. And he goes on to say that they treated enforcement as a political stunt. And he says, this is, if nothing else, the dirty secret no one on the left wants to admit. Resistance makes enforcement dangerous. If you obstruct lawful operations, you don't stop them, you complicate them, you prolong them, you radicalize the atmosphere around them. And the atmosphere basically breeds chaos. Then once the dust settles, the same leaders rush to the microphones and ask Washington, D.C. to pay their bill. It's a scam. They want the federal government to absorb the consequences of their own actions. Well, he winds down by saying, look, there was a choice, and Minnesota leaders chose the opposite. They chose optics over outcomes. They chose headlines over harmony. They chose virtue signaling over public safety. And now they want a reimbursement check. Don't think so, but if nothing else, just wanted to complete the circle on what is happening in Minnesota. And that brings us to another very important piece by Ann Coulter. This one appeared in Commonplace, a little harder place to find some of her articles, but I think it was very significant as it relates to some of these issues, because she really asked the question, how did they think open borders would end? So let's go back upstream a little bit, because we talk about the conflict and the chaos in some of the deportation. But she asks some pretty good questions or two. Could, she asks, the Democrats and the media tell us their plan to get rid of 10 million illegal immigrants that President Biden let in? That's a reasonable question, because I'm getting the sense that they don't have one. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't want anyone deported ever for any reason. Now, you might think that's hyperbole, but just think about this. Some of the individuals in the Democratic Party have been willing to go to the mat on, think of the Maryland man as a good example, or some of those that were deported to other prisons. And you're thinking, these aren't exactly the people that I would want to defend keeping into this country. But instead, we have 10 million so-called undocumented persons to come here, and we rewarded them, and we wonder then why they would be so resistant to leaving. And she gives us a pretty good list. We, first of all, rewarded them by meeting them at the border. We gave them, free hotel rooms, showers, hot meals, medical checkups, $400 debit cards, which were laundered through the United Nations, by the way, if you weren't familiar with that, and transportation to the American city of their choice. And again, were these illegal aliens or winners on the dating game, she says. Okay, a little bit tongue-in-cheek there. Then when they arrived, especially if they came into places where you had maybe Democratic governors or mayors, they also wanted to encourage things. And so sometimes they were providing free housing, meals, health care, child care, diapers, healthy snacks, baby formula, sometimes even driver's license, mental health counseling. Again, in our articles that we've posted in the past on immigration, certainly we should treat anyone that comes to the border with respect. But this was an attempt to make sure that they would be finding a very quick pathway to citizenship. I've got a commentary coming out next week where I just point out the fact that these were rushed through by actually violating some of the principles that are set forth by immigration and naturalization. But nevertheless, they point out that these were issues that were actually encouraging people to come here, to actually go into various parts of the country, and then to resist any kind of attempt to return them back to their country of origin. And so she points out that then when you had some of these individuals that were agitators who swarmed ICE agents, threw water bottles at them, vandalized their vehicles, kicked off their license plate, whatever it might have been, they were oftentimes canonized by the media. And he says, while this is consistent with the liberals' hatred of the police, it was wildly inconsistent with their admiration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who actually did deploy the military to squelch some of the Democratic governors back in the 1950s who thought that they could defy federal law. But it was also contrary, and I'd never thought about this, to some of the statements made by the New York Times. This is a direct quote from the New York Times, in which they said the federal government is deporting non-citizens and Americans, quote, have no business blocking them. And if nothing else, elected leaders, quote, should not be refusing to aid federal authorities. And if they do, that's insupportable. Maybe I say, did the New York Times say that? Yes, they said that back when Bill Clinton actually wanted to send little Elian Gonzalez back to the communist dictatorship of Cuba. Of course, they have been able to recognize that maybe we haven't had enough memory of that. But there was a time in which the New York Times specifically told individuals in the states that if the federal government was going to deport an individual, then the American people have no business blocking them, and no state government should be doing anything except aiding federal authorities. Isn't that interesting? And, of course, you've had some others that simply said, look, we've enforced immigration law in this country for over a century. And that's when, of course, you have a very good piece by Ann Coulter saying, no, we have not been enforcing immigration law in this country. As a matter of fact, we certainly, in many cases, have not even noticed that we have immigration laws. And she's asking a very good question. How did you think open borders would end? And do you have a plan to actually rid this country of people that are here illegally? And the answer is apparently not. And I think it's a very good piece by Ann Coulter, which goes into more detail about some of the policies that we used to follow not so long ago in this country, but seem to be violating now. And the premier example, of course, is Minnesota. Let's take a break. We got more to cover right after this.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about the fact that tomorrow we're going to have David McIver with us. So we're going to talk about his book, Looking for the One. And that is really kind of evangelism and discipleship. Looking for the One is really kind of based on Luke 15. Remember where, of course, we have this idea that Jesus is talking about the great shepherd goes and looks for the one. You know, the lost sheep, the lost coin, of course, the prodigal child, if you can take any of those. And so we're going to talk about how to maybe develop very compelling and engaging conversations in terms of evangelism, how to maybe just be good Christians in a world where, in some respects, by just being gracious individuals, we will stand out. So I think you'll enjoy that conversation as well. If you just joined us, I might just mention last hour we did talk about why empires fall and even a little bit about historical cycles. Those articles are still available to you at the website, pointofview.net. We just a few minutes ago talked about some very good pieces by Kevin McCullough and Ann Coulter, but I wanted to pick out another one here, and that is a topic I've been wanting to get to, but I sort of searched for a good article about the battle between the Defense Secretary, or the Secretary of War, as they want to call it, Pete Hegseth, and Senator Mark Kelly, who is a Democrat from Arizona. This, I think, again, is an illustration of how, in many cases, the Trump administration has gone too far. It is a good illustration of something that deserves some attention from a judge, and so I thought this piece from the Wall Street Journal was good. There have been a lot of people writing about this, and some have disparaged some of the individuals involved. And, you know, I've actually been able to meet Pete Hegseth. I've certainly followed the career of former astronaut and Senator Mark Kelly. When you have these kinds of dust-ups, I always hate this because we all should be working on the same team. But if you're not familiar, there has been, I think, a judicial rebuke of what was done by the Secretary of War or Defense, Pete Hegseth, in an attempt to punish Mark Kelly. If you're not familiar, again, we've talked about this before on the program, and we can get into all the detail, but I've given you an article that you can read, which I think did a good job of setting forth the legal case. And that is, the former Navy captain joined a number of other members of Congress taping a video advising current officers that they can refuse illegal orders. Okay, it was a little bit of a stunt. He may be running for the presidency. There were some others that wanted to maybe stick their finger in the eye of Donald Trump. But, you know, the reaction from Donald Trump calling it seditious behavior and the rest, of course, beyond the pale. But, again, what about this? Well, it didn't take long, as you might have imagined, for Senator Kelly to say, wait a minute, you're, first of all, issuing a letter of censure. And then as well, this would be something that could even begin reducing the person's rank. He's a captain, and pension, all sorts of other things, which, if you think about this, we've talked about this before when we dealt with some of these issues for those who refuse to take the vaccine with Kelly Shackelford. But anyway, I thought I would just use the particular judicial ruling from Judge Richard Leon. By the way, in case you're wondering, he was appointed by George W. Bush. He's not exactly a liberal activist, but nevertheless, he actually last week issued a decision, and he notes that, first of all, it is true, and I want to put that on the table, that it is a well-established doctrine that members of the military don't enjoy all First Amendment protections. We can't allow that within the military. We understand that. We've talked about this before in this program. So certainly they don't get, as he referred to it, the same rigorous First Amendment protection if they are in the military, because the military needs order and discipline. Got it, okay? But he says, unfortunately for Secretary Hegseth, no court has ever extended those principles to retired service members, much less a retired service member serving in Congress and exercising oversight responsibility over the military. And so that's why Judge Leon said this court will not be the first to do so. Well, then you can read the rest of it because the links are readable. Kind of interesting, in which the judge finds that Mr. Kelly's comments, this would be Senator Kelly's comments, are the definition of what we would consider to be protected speech under the First Amendment, and that the Pentagon cited no precedent that would limit speech for active duty officers that would also apply to retirees. So, I mean, you've got really just a impossible kind of criteria that was being established there. And the judge then goes on and say this was a clear case of illegal retaliation for speech he did not like. He points out that if legislators do not feel free to express their views and their views of their constituents without fear of reprisal by the executive, a representative system of government cannot function. What I appreciate about the Wall Street Journal is they didn't say this was a one-off. They reminded us of another case, and that's why I thought this was good, because at the same time, you have the attempt by the U.S. Attorney, that's Jeanine Pirro, who wanted to not only indict Mark Kelly, but the other members of Congress who taped the video. And that particular case also was set aside. So if you want to read all the details about this, I've been looking for someone that maybe isn't attacking the character of either Mark Kelly or Pete Hegseth, but is established in some clear principles. And we around this table believe in free speech, even when we disagree with it. Matter of fact, that's the best test sometimes of free speech. When an individual says something you disagree with, you're still given freedom to accept it. Just before I run out of time, let me also mention another very important piece that we'll probably discuss again on Friday, so I won't belabor it too long, but the midterm elections are taking place. Matter of fact, today I could go in and vote in the state of Texas. I don't know how many of you are able to vote this early, but the polls are open today if I wanted to vote. And so we are in the midterms, if you can't imagine that. And what is so interesting is this new survey, it was done by ARP of all things, focused on women ages 50 and older. And they're finding right now that older women are really concerned about the economy. So it illustrates the point we've made before. Matter of fact, if you get the upcoming issue of the Outlook, we talk about affordability as one of those issues. But it's interesting because they are saying that either party could win the older woman vote. So in some respects, these midterm elections might be won or lost on older women. What do I mean? First of all, let's be honest. Younger women tend to vote Democrat. Older men tend to vote Republican. Older women, they're not really a monolith. They could go either way. We're talking about women ages 50 to 64, okay? So we're talking about people in the latter part of the baby boom generation or people in Generation X. And I think it's a good example of the kind of thing that these older women are a block, but they could go either way. But what's so interesting is that women ages 50 to 64, they're worried about the economy. They are saying they may not have enough money for retirement. They found that older women voters often feel invisible, and they feel like there's a real need for individuals to maybe value them. And 3/5 of the women ages 50 to 64 said their own personal finances fall short of their expectations, compared with 2/5 of the women 65 years and older. And the survey really reflects kind of the challenges that some women really face. So even though we do have conversations about the next generation, which tend to be more Generation Y, which would be the millennial generation, Generation Z, maybe the next time we pull together a next generation conversation, I'm hoping that maybe Liberty and Chelsea can focus on some of these women who would be either in the early part of Generation X, maybe even the latter part of the baby boom generation, or Generation X themselves, because they might be the swing vote. Each time we have an election, they always talk about swing votes. In the past, sometimes they talked about soccer moms and others. But there seems to be some pretty good evidence right now that the older woman vote could go either way. And a lot of that has to do with concerns about the economy. Hence, one of the reasons oftentimes we talk about the economy here on Point of View. Well, let's take a break. By the way, I'll take a phone call or two if you'd like after the break. 1-800-351-1212. Hopefully we'll have time for our piece with Alan West. This is a piece that he's written that I think reminds us of some of the threats to our democracy. But I'll take some phone calls first. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And we'll either get to that article or we'll postpone it till tomorrow. Let's take a break, though. Got a lot of material on our website at pointofview.net. I would encourage you to grab it, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We began this hour by talking about this horrific shooting in the hockey rink there by a trans shooter, and certainly we'll take questions on any topic, but that is the first one that we'll talk about here in California, KNLB. And Kathy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, as far as the transgender, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, the issue is that when males go through that, it takes a year to 2 years for, I guess, their libido to drop, but it never really goes away. And it's a chemical thing as well, because their body and their brains are telling them that they're male, but they're frustrated because they want to be female, and it tends to cause violence. From what I understood from forgotten history, this all began back in the Assyrians when they started doing this.
Well, they didn't have the hormones we have now, and those are pretty powerful. I mean, these are psychotropic in some cases, and I just don't know whether it's either or. I think it's a both and, that both are dealing with maybe some gender dysmorphia, and we've talked about that before, or whether it is just, again, treating individuals with these hormones and causing extreme reactions. But to keep ignoring the obvious, and that is, as we pointed out just a minute ago, the number of mass shooters, pretty rare. The number of people that are transgender, pretty rare. You combine those two rare traits together, and we've got something that is more than just an occasional situation. It, I think, deserves some investigation, and I suspect we're going to hear more about that. So, Kathy, I appreciate that because, yeah, you talk about being torn between your body and your brain, your body and the chemicals. I can't even imagine. So I have.
Because it's like oxytocin, you know. We all have it, but we also have that hormone. And I was watching another one where people that had both sex, and in the 60s, and it brought up Money and Dr. Money, who was from Australia. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people that they did the transition to, like, who had both sex organs or they didn't, and they said, well, they're more this than that. Then later in years, because it caused them a whole lot of pain, it caused a lot of them feel that it was unnecessary surgery. They should have just left them how they were, because it causes a whole other medical issues.
Sure. And again, as I've pointed out before, and again, our booklet on transgenderism takes you back to some of the work that was done at Johns Hopkins University, where the head of the particular psychological area thought this would be an improvement and finally changed his mind. And then, of course, the trans activist came against him as well. But it's an illustration that we're learning a lot more. And as we pointed out last week, whether it was the American Medical Association or the Association of Plastic Surgeons, others are coming out with a different viewpoint. Let me take some more phone calls real quickly. We'll head to North Carolina. Fernando, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, Fernanda, I'm a female.
Okay, sorry. I did not, I just know it's red on the screen. But thank you for coming in. What would you like to add?
I would like to add that Minnesota, didn't they steal all of those $300 million with all of those whatever it is that they did? Why don't they use those to rebuild what they destroyed out of their own hands?
You got a good point.
It takes to get there.
Yeah. And again, I try not to laugh at some of these things, but I mean, you either laugh or you cry because you recognize the amount of graft and fraud that is surfaced. And frankly, for some time, if you said Minnesota in the past, it was that people that were in the know understood that you probably were talking about this incredible amount of fraudulent things that were taking place in Minnesota. But then, in some respects, the conflict with ICE became a distraction. But now I think over time, as people talk about Minnesota, they're going to once again go back to a discussion of the graft and fraud that has taken place at different levels within the state and the city. By the way, that same young individual who is called an independent journalist, but basically walks around with his phone and asks questions, he's now made his way to California, and we will probably cover some of those issues in the future in terms of the amount of voter fraud that has taken place that he's been able to uncover in that state. So he's moved from Minnesota to California. We'll kind of follow him as well. Just before we run out of time, let me just mention that we may get into this more tomorrow, but the last article I've posted for you is by Alan West, in which he points out that this threat to democracy comes from, first of all, this issue of the elections. He says that really the SAVE Act is the only way to implement voter ID for federal elections, and we're not nationalizing elections, nor is it Jim Crow. Of course, we read his piece the other day about that issue, and he reminds us that if you look at the 2024 election, Kamala Harris won all 12 states that did not have voter ID. I've got to wonder about that as well. And so he talks about that. He also talks about this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which we've talked about before, which is an attempt to get away from the Electoral College. Basically, what it says is that if your state actually votes one way, your state delegates to your state capital actually are to vote according to the popular election, not to the ones that particular people in the state voted for. It's an attempt to try to change the Electoral College without a constitutional amendment. Points out there are 17 states and the District of Columbia that have done it. Then points out that Virginia is now on the edge of maybe passing it as well. They won't implement it unless you have the requisite number of states to actually implement it. But I think it illustrates again that at every level, there are people trying to change the laws having to do with the elections. And it seems to me that one of the simplest laws should simply be this. If you want to vote, you need to be a citizen. If you are a citizen, you should be able to show us that you're a citizen, so then you should be able to vote. Pretty straightforward, but somehow that's very controversial to some members of Congress, and we'll probably implement an action item for the so-called SAVE Act in the future, but you can certainly contact your 2 United States senators right now about how they're going to vote on this issue of whether or not we should require an ID for elections. So, again, these are some issues we've been covering and we'll continue to cover here on Point of View. Let me just mention again that in the first hour, if you didn't happen to be with us, we did talk about why empires fall. Also have a piece on historical cycles, which is similar but longer than the booklet that we made available to you. And if you find yourself saying, yeah, I'd kind of like to print those out and read them again, or maybe give them to my children or my grandchildren, or pull a quote out and put it on Facebook or X or something of that nature, they are free of charge, available to you on the website, pointofview.net. Hope that you will take the time to find some of the other articles we've posted. My Viewpoints commentary today is about the concerns about cell phones, written by our good friend Robert Knight. And so lots of great resources. Take advantage of them and put them to good use in your sphere of influence. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, hopefully with the cameras working, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.